very original approaches, and I'd like to share some of them tonight. We're going to look, among other things, at the idiosyncratic designation of God of the Hebrews, which Moshe uses when he identifies Hashem to Paro a few times, and in our Parasha as well. And among other things, we'd like to understand from the perspective of our friend of the year what the meaning of that could be. But let's start at the very beginning. So we're in Parashas Bo. I hope you have your Chumash. It's chapter 10, the beginning of chapter 10 in Shos. Bo el Paro. Hashem says to Moshe, come to Paro, approach Paro. Because I've hardened his heart, in the heart of his servants. That I may place my wonders in his midst. Now, we know that Moshe has repeatedly approached Paro at Hashem's instruction, but this is the first time, the only time I think, where we have the expression Bo el Paro. And so that requires an explanation. Also, what is the cause of the hardening of the heart of Paro, particularly on this occasion? Now, it's true that Hashem told Moshe at the very beginning, I'm going to harden Paro's heart. And we find that after the first few plagues, Paro hardens his own heart. And subsequently, we find the Torah says that Hashem hardened his heart. But here it is like front and center, in which Hashem, the Torah doesn't just describe the event that God hardened his heart, but Hashem says to Moshe, Bo el Paro, ki ani chbadeti es libo, I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants as well. Why mention the servants, the subjects on this occasion also? And what was the proximate cause of the hardening of his heart? In other words, there is some reason why that Hashem brought about, which caused Paro to be especially notably obstinate on this occasion. As we've said, the obstinacy is a pattern throughout, but here the Torah highlights it. So Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz has an interesting suggestion. The plagues of our Parasha are the last three plagues: the plague of locust, the plague of darkness, and finally the climactic plague of the killing of the firstborn. The last plague that we've just completed the Torah's description of course, is the plague of hail. Now, what's interesting is that Hashem, or rather, Paro pleads with Moshe to terminate this hail storm. So, if you take a look at Pasuk, turn back at the end of last week's Parasha, and it says in Pasuk Chav Zayin, so chapter 9, verse 27. Paro sent for Moshe and Aaron, and he said, Chatasi apam, I've sinned on this occasion. Hashem at Tzadik va'ani va'ami harishaim, and I and my nation are the villainous ones. We're the wicked ones. Hatir al Hashem, pray to God. V'rabios kolos elokim uvarad. Terminate, stop these devastating the noise, the thunderstorm, and the barad and the hail. And I will send you out. So in the next pasuk, Moshe says, okay, when I leave the city, I will extend my hands to the heaven and I will pray to God. The thunder will stop, there won't be any more hail. So Para asks for the end of the thunder, the end of the hail, and Moshe says, you got it. I'm going to pray to God. I'll extend my hands to the heavens. No more thunder, no more hail. But when we turn the page, for me, I'm turning a couple of pages, I don't know what your Chumash has. And if you look in Pasuk Lamed Dalet, or rather Lamed Gimel, verse 33, Veitzem Moshe me'im Paro, es ha'ir, Moshe left Paro, he left the city, V'fros kapav al Hashem, and he extended his hands to the heaven, to God, V'yachdelu ha'kolos v'barad, u'matar lo nitach arza. And the thunder and the hail stopped, and the precipitation did not come down to earth. Now, Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz suggests something quite novel, that actually there were three things. There was the thunder, the hail, and there was also the rain, the precipitation. Paro said, no more thunder, no more hail. Moshe said, okay, no more thunder, no more hail. He prayed, and the thunder and the hail and the precipitation all stopped. Paro saw that the precipitation and the hail and the thunder stopped, and he continued to sin. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, Paro did not ask for the termination of the rain, of the precipitation. He quite liked that. Firstly, there's novelty value. It doesn't rain very much in Egypt. I did a bit of research. I don't know about ancient times, but in modern times, the rainfall in Egypt is about 1/10 of the rainfall in Israel. Now, the southern part of Israel has more limited rainfall, but taken as a whole, the Torah praises the land of Israel, or at least describes it. The rain, you won't have to irrigate your fields even. It will rain, and that will be adequate precipitation for your needs, adequate hydration. In Egypt, they had the great benefit of the flooding of the Nile, but there's quite a lot of work still involved with that because you've got to irrigate your field. You've got to either dig an irrigation channel or a canal or a ditch, or you've got to actually transport the water yourself, which is very laborious. Whereas if the water just comes from heaven, that's great. Of course, the downside is that there's a lot of insecurity about the uncertainty whether you have the precipitation or not. But when it rains, Paro said, "This is great. It's even better than the Nile, which floods. We have the benefit of the rain." So actually, Paro did not ask for no more rain. When the rain stopped as well, so Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says this gave Paro's Yetzer Hara, and obviously he had a very potent Yetzer Hara, the Pischon Peh, like the excuse to think, you know what, maybe it wasn't Moshe's prayer, because I didn't ask for the rain to stop. The rain has also stopped. It must be just a natural phenomenon, just a happenstance. The storm has passed. The sun is now out and shining. The rain that I actually wanted and I was happy to keep it going has come to an end as well. It wasn't even Moshe's prayer that did it. It was just a natural phenomenon. That's why it's come to an end altogether. So that promoted the hachbadat halev, the hardening of the heart of Paro. The fact that the rain also stopped. He goes so far as to suggest that Moshe was therefore ashamed to approach Paro the next time because Moshe felt as if his ability to deliver in accordance with Paro's request and in accordance with his own pledge, because if you look closely, we saw it already, Paro said no more thunder, no more hail. And Moshe said, okay, no more thunder, no more hail. But in fact, as it happened, there was no more rain either. Moshe was feeling a bit sheepish as a result. Excuse the pun, because the Egyptians worship the sheep. And Moshe's, maybe his famous meekness of spirit was on display. He was a bit embarrassed to go to Paro the next time. That's why Hashem said to him, Bo el Paro, approach Paro. Don't pay any heed to what has happened, that Paro is feeling as if he has good grounds now to be arrogant because he thinks that you didn't stop the hail or Hashem himself did not stop the hail. Don't worry. Moreover, there's something further he mentions. I'm going to elaborate a little bit. The Egyptians worshipped many gods. Pharaoh himself set himself up as a god. Of course, the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. They worshipped the crocodile, which is the symbol of the Nile and the might and the power of Egypt. But they also worshipped the sun. The sun god was very prominent in the Egyptian cult. There's a lot of archaeological evidence for that. And it's interesting, the name of the sun god, you can look him up, was Ra. When it says later on, Duki Ra'a neged penechem, so it may well be a reference to the Egyptian god of Ra, who was the god of the sun. Actually, Yonatan, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, possibly in the wake of the Exodus, introduced a kind of quasi-monotheism, a kind of, possibly under the influence of the Hebrew slaves and the experience of the Exodus. Maybe he forswore, he moved on. This Yonatan, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, moved on from polytheism to monotheism for a little while, worshiping the sun alone. So in any case, the sun was a very important god for the Egyptians. When the rain stopped and the sun came out, so it was a way of Pharaoh thinking, you know what, the rain which obscured the sun for a while, it's not that powerful. Our sun god is really in charge. The sun god has like restored or returned to its normal vigor. And again, that gave Paro more of a reason to think, actually, God of Israel is not in charge here at all. That's why Hashem said to Moshe, go to Paro, don't be ashamed, approach him, and I've got two more plagues, really the third one of the plague of the firstborn as well, but that which is the climactic one. But I've got two more plagues which are going to put the sun god in his place. The plague of locust, which obscured the sun, and of course the plague of darkness, which completely eliminated the sunshine during those days, day and night, day and night. So that's how he explains Boel Paro. Moshe was a bit sheepish, he was a bit bosh, he was embarrassed, and that's why Hashem had to tell him Boel Paro. Then he adds one last thing, which I think is very good. Boel Paro means approach Paro, come to Paro in Paro's natural environment, in other words, on his own terms, in his own turf. And even so, march into the palace and set him straight. Tell him, Boel Paro. Now, where did Moshe normally approach Paro? We find the Torah says exclusively twice, and it could well be that this was his habit on every occasion, and that's why the Torah specifies here specifically Boel Paro. Most of the time, Moshe would meet Paro. He would go to rendezvous with Paro by the river. Paro would go out in the morning on his own in privacy to the river, as Rashi explains why. And Hashem said to Moshe, that's when you go to meet Paro. Why? Because if Paro was in the company of his advisors, of his courtiers, they might have helped Paro to see sense. They might have persuaded Paro, relinquish your self-destructive obstinacy and let the people go. So because it was the Ratzon Hashem that Paro would refuse to do that, therefore Moshe approached Paro every time when Paro was on his own, and Paro in his obsessive behavior, maybe self-obsessive behavior, of course rebuffed Moshe repeatedly. Therefore here it says, the hearts of his servants are also hardened. So therefore it doesn't matter that his courtiers will be there, because they've become afflicted or infected with this same mishagas, this same perverse or self-defeating mindset of hardening of the heart. Of course, all of this is a bit reminiscent of Donald Trump as well. I don't know how much effort or how much success his cabinet had in talking sense to him. I suppose rather limited success, but anyway, that's maybe neither here nor there. So this is why he says, I've hardened the heart of Paro and his servants in this way, in order to set the stage for the next two plagues, the plague of locust and the plague of darkness, which would demonstrate the frailty, the futility of the god, the sun god, who was worshipped by the Egyptians. Okay, I'd like to turn now actually just two verses further. You probably have it on the same page. I've got to turn a few pages to find it in my edition. V'yavo Moshe v'Aaron el Paro v'yamur elav kol amar Hashem Elohei ha'ivrim. So says God, the God of the Hebrews. Now, the truth is, the expression God of the Hebrews is mentioned. Moshe mentions it to Paro in the past as well. Not quite sure why Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz explains it here rather than earlier. But he suggests two interesting approaches to the significance of this idiosyncratic phrase. Actually, God of the Hebrews is not as like grand. It's not as dignified a designation as the God of Israel, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. These are our forefathers. These are the ones who are the foundation of the Jewish people. These are the ones, of course, who represent the basis of our Jewish legacy, and therefore it requires an explanation. Why does Moshe say to Paro, Elohei ha'ivrim? Now, if anything, Ivrim is a more general, more generic term. And the explanation, the well-known explanation, and by the way, I think in the Nitziv, he says if we don't find this expression, God is not known as the God of the Hebrews after Matan Torah. We never again find that expression of Hey HaIvrim. After Matan Torah, we find Yisrael or Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, are not referred to as Ivrim anymore. That's why the expression Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, requires an explanation. And of course, not for now, but there is an explanation as to why the Torah refers to an Eved Ivi rather than Eved Yisrael or something similar. But to identify Hashem as the God of the Hebrews, this is unusual, but we find it repeatedly when Moshe is speaking to Paro. God, so to speak, identifies himself to Moshe, saying, say to Pharaoh, God of the Hebrews. So what is the derivation of it? So usual explanation, which probably is the Pashut Pshat, is that it's a reference to Abraham, who came Me'ever HaNahar, from the other side of the river. Eloi HaIvrim, God of the Hebrews, it means we are descended from Abraham, who came from the other side. If you've seen the comic, the far side, well, that's where Abraham came from. Abraham, so to speak, crossed over the river. The Medrash says that Abraham was on one side of the world and the rest of humanity was on the other side, vis-a-vis monotheism. When the world was awash with paganism, with polytheism, with idolatry, Abraham stood alone as a lonely voice in the service of the one God of what we know as ethical monotheism. This is probably the usual explanation and probably the Pashut Pshat. He came Eiver HaNahar, the other side of the river being the Mesopotamia, the two rivers, the fertile crescent. He came from the other side of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and he traveled to the land of Canaan, and therefore he became known as the one who came from Eiver HaNahar, Eiver from the other side. Okay, that is the usual explanation. I want to share with you two approaches, one fascinating, the other I think even more so. So the first thing he says is quoting the Kuzari, that maybe Abraham is called Abraham HaIvri, not for the reason I just said, but because he is descended from Eiver. Eiver was one of the early personalities in the early generations of mankind. I'm sure you've heard, I hope you have heard, if not, let me be the first one to tell you about the yeshiva of Shem ve'Eiver. It's something found in our Midrashic tradition in a few places, that there was a place of study. I don't know whether they studied Torah exactly, the Torah had not yet been given. Maybe they studied philosophy, theology, maybe they studied ethics, they studied morality, they may have studied law, in the sense of a law governing a just society. There's quite a lot to study. And it was founded, or it was associated with Shem, the son of Noach, and Eiver. Eiver was the great-grandson of Shem. So Shem ve'Eiver, Shem was maybe the original founder, and Eiver was his great-grandson. Now, they lived a long, long time, many hundreds of years in those early generations, so they would have overlapped. But in any case, Eiver was an ancestor of Abraham. Says the Kuzari, the famous Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in his dialogue, the book that he wrote called Kuzari, he says that Abraham HaIvri is known by that name because Abraham was the manifestation of the righteous qualities. I would say Abraham even further developed the righteous qualities of Eiver. Eiver was I've got here in my notes, in terms of Abraham, he was the grandfather of Abraham. Is that right? Not quite. He was a few generations before Abraham. And the qualities of Eiver became manifest in Abraham, in Yitzchak, and in Yaakov. So Abraham is called Abraham HaIvri because he is a descendant of Eiver. Says the Kuzari that Nahor, who was the grandfather of Abraham had a brother Nahor, but he also had a grandfather by the name of Nahor. Kuzari says that the qualities, the genetic trait that was passed down from Eiver, who was righteous, became manifest in Abraham, and the qualities of Nahor, the grandfather of Abraham, were manifest in Yishmael and in Esau. So it's a kind of early, let's say, a forerunner of Mendelian genetics, recognizing the importance, the influence of genetic traits. And there is such a phenomenon of a trait that will skip a generation. One finds it even with people that we know in our own times, where there are certain traits, certain qualities, even eye color, or certain other genetic traits which can be manifest sometimes. You know, we have a child who may have red hair, and I don't have red hair. My wife doesn't have red hair, but maybe my grandmother had, and maybe my wife's grandmother had red hair, or my wife's mother had red hair. And even though we don't have it, it can skip a generation. It's not at all unusual, but putting the genetics in a scientific sense to one side, this is what Kuzari says that Heha Ivrim, because the Jewish people are called Ivrim because we are the bearers of the tradition of the righteous achievements and influence of Aver, who was the ancestor of Abraham. So Abraham, so to speak, became like a magnet for the righteousness of Aver, which no doubt he developed further. But then he suggests a completely different explanation as well. Very novel, I would suggest. My humble opinion. He says like this. Aver had a son Peleg, and the Torah says why he was named Peleg, Kibiyom of Niflagu Ha'amim, because in the days of Aver, or maybe even more so in the days of his son, the nations became splintered. They went their separate ways. They became, rather than a single united mankind after several generations following the flood, they broke up and they went their separate ways. Why did they do that? Peleg is from the word miflaga, dor hapelaga, the generation of the dispersion. Why were they dispersed? Of course, it was the generation of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel. In fact, it's been suggested that the word Babel, B-A-B-B-L-E, not Scrabble, but Babel. Babel is derives from this word Bavel, because their languages were confused. Babel is like a cacophony of words or speech that you can't make any sense of. So the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. What happened to the Tower of Babel? So of course we know that the people got together and embarked on a great building project. But the Torah says, "Vayikol ha'am Safa echad udvarim achadim." Safa echad, one language. They had one language, and therefore they were able to unite. And they united on a project, a great building project of Migdal Bavel. And this was a project that was heading in the wrong direction. Its purpose was wrong. We'll discuss it maybe on another occasion what it was all about. Anyway, as is very well known, Hashem confused their language. Everyone spoke a different language, one to the other. They had to go their separate ways. What language were they speaking? What was the Safa? So Rashi says, Lashon HaKodesh, they spoke the Hebrew language. Why? So here, Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says, because the Hebrew language has a sanctity and has a potency and has a capacity for creativity which is unparalleled in all man-made languages. Lashon HaKodesh has Sirufei Shemos. There are letter combinations which form in esoteric names of God. The Kabbalistic tradition sheds some light on this. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz that according to our tradition, through the combination of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, it's possible to accomplish extraordinary things. Even the angels will hearken to the instructions of the Hebrew language. According to those who know how to, so to speak, fashion and weave the letters together. I'm thinking, although he doesn't quote it, I'm thinking of the famous statement about Betzalel. Yodea Haya Betzalel, that Betzalel, the great artisan, knew how to combine the letters Shebo Nivru, Shebehem Nivru, Shamayim Va'aretz, through which heaven and earth were created. So the Hebrew language has the capacity for building, which goes far beyond the man-made languages. And that was why they embarked on this project, and they had a great chance of success. But because their intentions were flawed, Hashem dispersed them, and they all spoke different languages. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, when Paro met these Jewish people, he thought they were speaking Hebrew. He thought, hey, these guys can be useful to me. And he put them to work building cities, fortified cities, Arei Mitzarot. Aremiskanos, and he put them to building on these very ambitious projects. Now, it's not clear to me or to other scholars, I'm not even a scholar, whether the pyramids, which in Egypt is famous to this very day, were built by the Hebrew slaves. It's a bit doubtful, actually. But nevertheless, those are building projects which astound visitors even today, thousands of years later. Anyone who's been to the Egyptian pyramids realizes he's gazing upon one of the wonders of the world, of the ancient world, how they're able to build those pyramids. So just, I'm not saying our ancestors necessarily built them, but we see that Paro had great ambitions when it came to building. So he thought these Jews who speak the language of Ava, they speak Ivrit, Lashon HaKodesh, so they are the ones who I'm going to get to undertake this great building project, because that was the power of the generation that undertook to build the Tower of Babel, and they would have succeeded if they had just continued using that Hebrew language. But Hashem thwarted their plans, and so they were dispersed. This is what he says about Elohei HaIvrim. That's why Hashem told Moshe, address yourself to Paro and make reference to the God of the Hebrews. I just wanted to add, I put here in my notes, that even nowadays, a few of our co-religionists have had quite a lot of success with building projects as well. Don't want to mention any of the names, but when you visit any of the big shopping malls all over the world, there's an Australian Jewish guy who's behind most of those, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a bit old economy now. Who knows whether there will be so much money to be made in the building field, but I'm drifting off into another subject. Point is, this is an insight into Elohei HaIvrim, because Paro, so to speak, sought to harness not just the manpower, but the language, the linguistic talents of the Jewish people. And as the Medrash says, Shiloshinu Lishonam, they did not change their language. The Jewish people merited to be redeemed because they kept their Hebrew language. So the mastery and the usage of the Hebrew language was a characteristic of our ancestors, even in Mitzrayim, even when they were persecuted and enslaved, and even, it has to be said, when they abandoned so much more of their tradition, as the Medrash famously says, that the Egyptians were idolaters and the Jews at the time were also idolaters as well. I've got just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to briefly share with you a last thought about this striking turn of phrase. If you look at Pasuk Zayin, just a few more verses, we're not getting beyond this first chapter tonight. Vayomru Avdei Paro Elav, in verse 7, chapter 10, verse 7. Vayomru Avdei Paro Elav, the servants, the subjects of Paro, maybe the courtiers of Paro, said to him, Ad masai zeh lanu lemokesh, how long will this be a snare for us, whether Moshe or your failure to release the Jewish people? Shalach es ha'anashim v'yavdu es Hashem Elokehem. Send the people out, let them serve the Lord their God. And then the last words, which are very compelling. Haterem teda ki avda Mitzrayim. Do you still not know that Egypt is lost? Haterem teda. Don't you realize? Do you still not know that Egypt is going down the tubes because of your obstinacy? Why don't you release the Jewish people? So Rabbi Yonatan actually says, Haterem teda. The word terem means something which like has been in place for a long time. Haterem teda. Why are you coming so late to the party? Haterem teda. Do you not yet know? Everybody else has known it for years. You're only waking up to it now. Don't you realize? Haterem teda. So Rabbi Yonatan actually says that the reference is like this. Paro, they say, you are very shrewd. You're very crafty. You're very, maybe a bit paranoid. And you recognize that these Jewish people are a threat to us. Really, they were probably no threat at all. But you said, let's deal shrewdly, maybe guilefully with them. Because if we don't, then when there may be a war, they're increasing. They're becoming so numerous. It will occur that if a war comes to our land, So namely, there'll be fifth columnists. They will. I'm just looking back to the words exactly, but it's not that important. Everybody knows it very well. 10-year ban, lest they increase. Okay. So the people said, Paro, you recognize very early that they could be a threat. So what was your brainstorm to subjugate them, to enslave them, so that they won't increase? Well, that was a bust. They've increased more and more. Not only that, but they're not enslaved anymore even, because after these plagues, according to our tradition, the Gemara Rosh Hashanah says that the plagues began on Rosh Hashanah. The Torah doesn't say how long the plagues lasted. According to our tradition, there was a warning period or sort of a buffer period of a few weeks, and each plague lasted a week. That's our tradition. It is evident, though, even just at face value, that this process of these 10 plagues extended over a period of time. According to our tradition, they began on Rosh Hashanah. Once the plagues began on Rosh Hashanah, there was no more slavery, there was no more servitude. They couldn't leave, but there was no more servitude. So the people said to him, your great plan about enslaving them and inhibiting their increase has been a bust, but they're not even enslaved anymore, which means that they're very numerous. They're no longer enslaved. They're no longer downtrodden. They're no longer subordinate. All they want to do is leave. If you don't let them leave, then they're going to completely overwhelm us. In other words, your original fear, where is your wisdom and where is your fear? The solution is just release them. And he doesn't say it explicitly, but they probably told Paro, we have to be grateful, thank our lucky stars or whoever they wanted to thank, that they don't want the revolution. Because if they wanted a revolution, they could overthrow all of Egypt as well. They don't want the revolution. They just want to leave. They just want to get out. So let them go. Let them go and serve their God. Your thought that Egypt is endangered, that Egypt is imperiled because of them, has come to full fruition. So all you got to do now is let them go. Otherwise, we're all goners. It's a bit like the struggle for Soviet Jewry. If you remember the prisoners of conscience, I'm old enough to remember them. They were not necessarily looking to overturn Soviet Russia from within, to transform it. That might be a very idealistic, wonderful plan. Probably still would be a good idea in some ways, a lot of room for improvement in the Soviet Union. But the point is that the Jewish refuseniks didn't want any of that primarily. They just wanted to get out. And eventually, of course, they were released to a great extent. So this is, I'm talking about the Soviet Jews, were released to a very great extent. And of course, Paro ultimately released the Jewish people as well, although not through his own will. Again, the pleadings of his own subject, can be understood in this way as well. So just to review, we've seen tonight why Paro's heart was hardened, specifically in the aftermath of the plague of the hail, because he actually liked the rain. It was quite nice, quite a novelty. And when the rain stopped as well, Paro said, well, it must just be a natural phenomenon, and therefore his heart was hardened. And we saw about, especially, I think, the very novel suggestion, Elokei HaIvrim, because Paro sought to harness the power of the Ivrim, of the Jewish people who spoke the Hebrew tongue, Ivrit. And this was a means by which possibly they were very successful, and therefore they were very useful in his building projects. And then just now we've seen Haterem Teda. You, Paro, know about the peril that they represent to us, or so you imagined, and yet your plan has come to naught. So therefore you better release them, otherwise indeed Egypt will be lost. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the shiur. Wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and hopefully I'm confident that next week we will learn more creative, imaginative, and original insights from Yonatan Eibeschutz into the Parasha week by week. So thank you again, and Shabbat Shalom l'kulam.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rav.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.